Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon and good evening. Thank you for joining us. I'm Michelle Breslauer, Senior Manager of Governance and Peace with the United Nations Global Compact. And we're here today to discuss a private sector approach to fragility, conflict, and COVID-19. So we do have a lot to unpack for the next 30 minutes where we'll be having this discussion. Our conversation today is co-hosted by the UN Global Compact, which is a special initiative of the UN Secretary General, and it's a call to companies everywhere to align their operations and strategies with 10 universal principles in the areas of human rights, labor, environment, and anti-corruption. The compact was launched in the year 2000, so we are acknowledging our 20th anniversary this year. And our mandate is to guide and support the global business community in advancing UN goals and values through responsible corporate practices. And we're co-hosting with the Connecting Business Initiative, which is co-managed by the UN Development Program and the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. And it aims to strategically engage the private sector in disaster risk reduction, preparedness, response, and recovery, and to support the integration of country-level private sector networks into disaster management mechanisms and humanitarian coordination structures. And I'm very pleased to welcome our two speakers today. So I'd like to welcome first Rein Paulsen, who's the acting director for the Coordination Division of the UN's Department for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, and Christina Bache, who's a visiting fellow at the London School of Economics and Political Science. She's also chair of the Business for Peace Working Group of the Principles for Responsible Management Education and co-chair of the International Crisis Group's Ambassador Council. So I'd like to start with why we're really having this conversation today. Both the Connecting Business Initiative and the UN Global Compact work in the areas of business and peace, which means that we both take a look at what are conflict-sensitive business practices and what's the role of the private sector in building resilience and in building peace. And while we've seen that the connection between COVID-19, the global pandemic, and areas that are more fragile or conflict affected has been discussed, we're hearing more about the large humanitarian impact of this pandemic. We really haven't heard much discussion about the role of the private sector in response and building back better. And so today we really want to try to be one of the first to investigate that lens of what can business do, because really there's a great opportunity for the private sector to make meaningful contributions in the face of these varying crises. And not only can the private sector work to respond by providing personal protective equipment, raising awareness of mitigation measures, providing food and other non-food items, and supporting small businesses in their value chain, but they could even try to become a catalyst for peace, where businesses can work to strengthen social cohesion, battle misinformation, foster trust, and support the vulnerable. So to kick off and to frame our conversation, I'd like to pose the first question to Rein. Could you give us a sense and a brief overview maybe of how there are multiple crises right now converging in fragile contexts? And really specifically, how is the current pandemic affecting conflict-affected areas on one hand and humanitarian operations on the other?
Well, thank you so much, and it's a pleasure to be able to join and participate in this very timely discussion, and thanks to colleagues for hosting it today. So 2020 has, without a doubt, been a year like no other, and amid ongoing violent conflict, rising hunger, the effects of climate change, the pandemic, as we know, will continue to have a significant effect as we look into 2021. As the health and non-health effects of COVID-19 merge with other shocks, humanitarian programming as you would expect, is also adjusting to treat those needs and those requirements in a more integrated manner. Just to put this in context, at the beginning of 2020, nearly 170 million people in the world needed humanitarian assistance. Looking forward to 2021, we estimate that's going to be about 235 million people. And the pandemic is having a devastating impact in areas affected by conflict and fragility, where these threats overlap with pre-existing social, economic, and health concerns. Let me just take maybe two quick examples from many that we could speak to. In Yemen, COVID-19 has added another layer of vulnerability and stress to a country already ravaged by conflict and devastated by war. The health system is broken, famine is looming, and diseases such as cholera are also spreading. Our assessments show that as many as half the population are in acute need of humanitarian assistance. If I take another country context, northern Mozambique, fighting has also been escalating there recently, forcing thousands of people to flee their homes. And many have fled to areas that were already affected by COVID-19. Temporary shelter sites provide sanitation, and there are challenges there which further increase risk to public health. Research from epidemics and health emergencies highlights the interplay that exists between infectious diseases and armed conflict. Conflict and insecurity often exacerbates disease transmission and hinders public health responses, and in some places, COVID-19 and its consequences are aggravating existing conflicts and increasing the risk of new ones, while simultaneously impacting the delivery of humanitarian assistance. So overall, the health impacts and the mitigation measures of the pandemic, as well as their socioeconomic impacts, are leading to what we estimate to be a 40% increase in the number of people needing humanitarian assistance, as highlighted in the 2021 Global Humanitarian Overview launched earlier this month. The World Food Programme has warned that several countries are at the brink of famine, and 2021 could become the worst humanitarian crisis year since the beginning of the United Nations. Again, the situation is particularly dire in conflict-affected areas where violence hinders people's ability to produce and process or otherwise obtain and access food. COVID-19 has changed the landscape for humanitarians, pushing for operations to be adapted in light of things like movement restrictions. Many international staff have been unable to travel and access affected areas. The role of local actors, therefore, has increased significantly, and this provides an opportunity for the private sector, and I would say in particular local businesses, to play an even more significant role in the communities where they operate. And these are really the issues that we want to explore further today, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing from Christina on how she sees private sector contributions to peace, stability, and the COVID-19 response. Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you. And that's a great segue to you, Christina. Really, in the first question, helping us to sort of frame the conversation and maybe explain to those who are listening, what does it mean for the private sector to be conflict sensitive or peace positive? The business and peace space is still relatively new. And I think that even when we're speaking about crises, we are talking about that spectrum of everything from health crises to man-made crises. And so really in your research and work, what is this space looking at, and what does it mean for a business to be conflict sensitive?
Well, thank you, Michelle and Rein, and also to Tina and others for organizing today's timely discussion. The Business for Peace field is an interdisciplinary field of study that leans on business ethics and law, peace and conflict management, gender, and increasingly environmental studies. The field emerged about 2 to 3 decades ago when academics such as Robert McNulty, Tim Ford, Jennifer Odsell, civil society organizations like Human Rights Watch and Transparency International, community leaders, concerned customers, and industry leaders were interested in learning more about how business, especially multinational corporations, manage risks in complex environments, how the behavior and practices of companies in the supply chain impacted not only brand loyalty, but also the well-being of communities, and then the ethical arguments associated with companies engaging in corrupt business practices to secure contracts. So today the field is still evolving. However, there is a consensus that business, regardless of size, sector, composition, whether or not they're informal or formal, can shape the conditions that determine whether fragility evolves into armed conflict or durable peace. And two main peace paradigms frame the way we look at businesses engaged in complex or fragile and conflict-affected situations. So on the one hand, we have the negative peace paradigm, which relates to an absence of violence. And with this lens, we could look at how companies, for instance, are engaged in the war economy, might fuel violence by manufacturing weapons that are used on civilians. And on the other hand, the positive peace paradigm is framed by both an absence of violence as well as social justice, equality, human rights, participatory forms of governance, economic opportunity, and society's social relations. Academic studies and data sets, including those conducted by the United Nations, the Institute for Economics and Peace, the World Bank, and the World Economic Forum, all demonstrate that the level of gender equality and women's meaningful participation across all spheres of the society are important indicators of how peaceful a society is. So here, business can bolster gender equality and women's participation in the economy by easing access to the labor market and improving job retention. As research and interest in the role of business and society have expanded, so has the emphasis by international organizations that business is an essential stakeholder in addressing global challenges, including climate change, inequality, poverty, and others as stated in the Sustainable Development Goals. There is also a growing expectation that business sees itself as a critical stakeholder and acts accordingly. Rooted in the humanitarian development peace nexus, conflict sensitivity and do no harm principles can help companies better understand how their operations impact communities, manage risks, and resolve potential flashpoints for conflict. When it comes to the connection between business, gender equality, and peace, company leadership can lean on these principles to understand the situation and possibilities for vulnerable groups, particularly women in the economy. They might ask questions about the structural and cultural barriers to women entering and remaining in the labor market, what factors impede women's economic security even after a job has been secured. Are there policies in place that aim to enhance female labor force participation and gender equality? And are there laws that prohibit gender-based discrimination in the hiring process? So based on this sort of assessment, companies can adopt certain practices such as transparent hiring, fair wage structures, a safe and inclusive working environment that considers women's needs, among others, to positively impact their workforce, labor market, communities, and broader societies in which they are engaged.
Thank you, Christina. So now we've heard a little bit about business and peace, but then also the great humanitarian crisis that we're facing and how this is playing out. So I wanted to pose to both of you the question of, are there any examples right now about how the private sector, whether at the international, national, or local level, perhaps most importantly, given Rein's comments earlier, is working alongside governments, the UN, or civil society organizations to make contributions to peace and stability?
There are a number of, I think, really interesting and encouraging examples. Maybe let me just take a few that are ongoing currently or have recently occurred. So the private sector, if we think back to the tragedy of the Beirut port explosions in Lebanon in August, there we saw private sector entities mobilizing quickly, contributing to stability in a time where Lebanon was facing multifaceted political, economic, social crisis aggravated by the COVID-19 situation. And beyond the financial and in-kind contributions that were given to address the immediate humanitarian needs, we saw that private sector organizations were also supporting small and medium enterprises from the perspective of business continuity, and recognizing that SMEs make up over 90% of Lebanese businesses, helping them to resume economic activity was vital, and not only to helping those companies themselves, but to establish and support society to get back on its feet, serving very much as a stabilizing, positive stabilizing impact. Similarly, if we think about responses that are underway at the moment in Central America to hurricanes Iota and Eta, local and regional private sector networks are working tirelessly to address immediate needs and support and strengthen the socio-economic fabric of those countries, working in tandem, in close coordination, as you would expect, with governments, with the UN, with civil society, in an environment also where climate change is unfortunately demonstrating its growing devastating impact on already contexts that are extremely fragile. Maybe another couple of quick examples, and there are many we could refer to. I think back to April of this year, 2020, when the United Nations joined forces with private sector entities to launch a partnership to tackle COVID-19 in Yemen. And with the help of the private sector, the World Health Organization received a significant shipment, 43 tons of medical aid and laboratory supplies, which were able to enter the country through this partnership. The Connecting Business Initiative, CBI member networks, also provide, I think, some fascinating and compelling examples. We think back to CBI member network, the CBI member network in the Philippines, and the Philippine Disaster Resilience Foundation, PDRF, which has been working closely with Marawi City, alongside the government, the United Nations, and civil society for several years, since 2017, when conflict broke out in the city. And now, during the pandemic, this network has provided PPEs, personal protective equipment, to rural health centers, and in the province of Lanao del Sur, including Marawi City. And recognizing the importance of income generating activities and opportunities in post-conflict recovery, the network has provided livelihood assistance and market access to women weavers. And now they're supporting them to set up a new program for coffee farmers to revive production of a key crop and product in a region where this was traditionally the case. So there are many other examples we could refer to, but I think this diversity of context and examples shows us just how dynamic private sector engagement can be in this context.
Absolutely. Christina, do any examples come to mind for you?
For sure, there are many examples. I'd have to remind us that the way companies respond to the range of issues in the crisis will have long-term effects on company operations and societies during the recovery phase. There's a lot of discussion of building back better, but I think it's important that we understand what that actually means in practice, whether or not economic growth really bolsters positive peace attributes. We know through research that economic growth does not necessarily translate into greater gender equality. However, gender equality does have a positive effect on economic growth. As restrictions of movements have made it difficult to source materials and products from other markets, as Rein mentioned, many local businesses, many which are micro, small to medium-sized enterprises, have provided vital goods and services to the communities in which they're engaged. For instance, many textile companies in Asia and in North Africa have switched their operations to manufacturing personal protection equipment and other essential healthcare related items to generate revenue and to avoid cutting jobs. These sorts of switches in manufacturing outputs have been particularly important for small companies who do not have large cash flows, and for workers, especially those living under the poverty line. Larger companies and multinational corporations such as Schneider Electric and Total, for instance, have expanded their social investments and provided short-term assistance such as food, face masks, and hand sanitizer for health workers, and then other perishable items to communities facing extreme vulnerability. And then there's another example that I find particularly interesting, and that is of the South African Future Trust, which has designated financial support to small and medium-sized enterprises impacted by the pandemic. The fund provides direct financial relief via interest-free loans to permanent employees of South African micro, small, and medium-sized businesses who are at risk of losing their jobs or suffering income loss due to COVID-19. And then I just want to mention that there are quite a few platforms that are promoting or highlighting these kinds of multi-sector stakeholder initiatives. And of course, we have the Connecting Business Initiative. We have one which was launched by the institution I'm affiliated with, LSE Ideas, that is called Better Together. Of course, we have the Global Compact, the Principles for Responsible Management Education's working groups, especially the one that I'm a part of, the Working Group on Business for Peace, who are all looking for ways business can make contributions to peace and stability in light of the COVID-19 environment.
Thank you. And I think, one thing that we were speaking about actually before we started this webinar that's of particular importance is that when we are thinking about these response initiatives and businesses, for instance, pivoting to manufacturing personal protective equipment, what the Business for Peace space can do is help to better inform perhaps private sector and private sector networks about conflict dynamics that are existing or that can be exacerbated, so that when we look at the distribution of these goods, when we look at the access, we take into account what inequalities may be existing and make sure that we don't further those and create potential for more disenfranchisement, instability, conflict. And so I do think that, among these examples, kind of the next step for our community really is to think about, how do we make sure that what we know from past experience and what we have been working on is put into place in the moment of crisis, and that we can build that into our response initiatives. So I guess that does lead me to asking you both, right now there's a lot of attention and focus, rightly so, on COVID-19 from the international community. Budgets are being allocated towards COVID-19 responses across the globe. How do we call attention to the role of complex contexts, fragile contexts here? How do we make sure that when our own focus is internal, that we are still taking into account the global situation? And do you have any call to action for the private sector to step up? Is there anything we can do collectively to enable more companies specifically to play a more active role? And I invite both of you to comment on that.
So maybe a couple of comments from my side on this. I do think we're facing a particularly challenging time. I mean, I mentioned some of the global numbers at the very top of this webinar, and of course those terrible numbers where we talk about 235 million people in need of assistance. That reality is happening at the same time, of course, where we have countries that represent some of the larger economies in the global context are also suffering major economic impacts, and we see the huge efforts that governments rightly are putting in place to mitigate economic impacts in countries that have traditionally been donors or supporters. We do clearly have a moral obligation and a duty to stand with the most vulnerable in their hour of need. That's what the launch of the Global Humanitarian Overview on the 1st of December was all about. But I think equally, and I hope we're all motivated by the need to support rights, the right to life with dignity that underpins everything we do. I think it's important also to signal that it's in countries' self-interest also to support these most vulnerable and affected communities. We know, if we've learned anything from this tragedy of the pandemic, it's that as long as the pandemic and COVID-19 exists anywhere and has not been addressed with, it represents a global risk and a global threat. So these hard lessons, I think, should be driving all of us. I mean, maybe to come, if I could, Michelle, to the final part of your question around call to action for the private sector. I think this reflection that we would encourage private sector to engage in around the role that they can play, and Christina's been talking about it, in contributing to peace and stability in context, I think is something that maybe isn't highlighted enough and needs to be underscored, and indeed is the purpose of this webinar. And the way in which private sector engages is so important in that regard, to ensure that and not only are positive contributions made, at a minimum, there is no harm that is done. So, I mean, in order for private sector to step up, I think from our side, on the humanitarian side, we need to ensure that all opportunities are made for inclusion of private sector in planning responses, in the implementation of solutions, doing this in a joint manner that we do periodically, but maybe not as consistently as any of us would like. And I think therefore it's up to all of us to make sure that the private sector stakeholders are treated as equal partners in this initiative. That's certainly our desire and our commitment. And we've certainly, to give one example, been encouraging the inclusion of private sector networks in our country level coordination mechanisms. Our humanitarian country teams, Philippines is a good recent example. So this would be my encouragement, and also a call to humanitarian actors to make sure we're providing the right type of enabling environment for private sector stakeholders to engage.
Thank you, Christina.
Sure. I would have to say that, or remind us that there is a growing community of concerned consumers, citizens, investors, shareholders, and policymakers that expect business to look beyond simply maximizing profits. But I think, for especially smaller companies, micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises that do not have the human resources or the financial resources that maybe larger companies have, that may be a challenge for them, or a bit overwhelming to adopt these kinds of conflict-sensitive, do no harm, peace-positive type activities into their operations. So I think it's important for us to demonstrate that there are certain steps that they can take that will lead them to positively transforming the communities in which they're engaged in. And I think it takes a collective action on the part of all stakeholders to come together to see where there are entry points for business to go about doing that. And I think that there are quite a few, I mentioned already, these platforms that have been built to promote private sector engagement that is positive for communities. But there are also many toolkits that organizations like the UN, like ICRC and CIPRI and DCAF have published to make it much easier for stakeholders, including business, to go about impacting their communities in a positive manner.
And one thing that I was thinking about as well when you were talking about the positive peace paradigm for businesses is that we do really want to think about business as an internal actor as well as a local actor. So the importance of, in this COVID context right now, businesses continuing to operate, continuing to employ, continuing to pay wages at whatever level they operate is crucial. And we see that across various contexts, but even more so in fragile ones that face multidimensional threats. And I think that does present a call also for governments, for the international community to step up and try to also make sure that we are operating collectively and in a space where we, as you said, Rein, create that enabling environment for the private sector as well. So we're coming up to our 30 minutes. We've had this sort of flash talk around this issue. And of course, we'll encourage anybody who's tuning in live or watching this video to get in touch with the Connecting Business Initiative or the UN Global Compact afterwards, if they'd like more information and to take a look at some of the resources and platforms also that Christina highlighted. But if there's anything, if there's one point that each of you would like listeners to take away from this conversation, share it now. What's that one major point that you'd like people to leave with? Rein?
Thank you, Michelle. Well, so maybe, I mean, building on your last comment, given everything we've talked about, the complexity of issues, the interplay of factors, particularly in these fragile contexts, and knowing what the private sector and companies have and can leverage in terms of expertise, experience, networks, connections, it's just indispensable that we find these practical ways to work as one and to connect private sector, to better engage private sector in finding and providing solutions. And I think it's important that we understand that that should also and can also happen in fragile and conflict affected areas. We may not have given that as much visibility in the past, but there are some models that work, and we would certainly encourage deliberate attention to the area moving forward.
Great, and Christina?
Sure, I would echo what Rein just said and mention that business cannot nor should substitute the need for strong institutions and fundamental reforms of governance structures. However, companies have the know-how, the innovation, the investment, the drive necessary to transform society. So I think it's up to us to demonstrate what those opportunities are for business to engage, to be part of the solution and not part of the problem.
Great. Well, I'm glad you both had such reinforcing messages. And I'd like to thank my co-hosts at the Connecting Business Initiative and both of our speakers here today, and to everybody who's tuning in. Thank you so much.
Thank you.